Night of the Shadow Man. I hate the dark. I can't help myself. I just hate it. I can't stand to be in it, around it, or anywhere near it. It panics me. It terrifies me. I sweat. I shake. I scream. I'm a grown man. I have my own apartment, my own job, my own car, but being in the dark still makes me violently frightened. Things have been this way my entire life ever since infancy. Few would argue that I'm abnormal for a child to be afraid of the dark. Certainly, but the intensity and dramatic reaction that I had been like in this room were everything but normal. I was petrified of darkness before I even learned to walk, read, or even speak. Some of the earliest memories of my life was a baby laying in the crib, crying frantically, screaming my lungs out, kicking the bars of my bed. I didn't have the words of the comfortability to describe it at the time, but I felt like I wasn't alone. I felt like someone was there watching me, invading my personal space. My parents would rush in, try and figure out what was wrong. It didn't take them long to figure out what was causing my tantrum. They brought me a nightlight to try and place me. In the few years it worked. There would be blackouts and power failures, and I would go berserk, but they would always quick rush in with a candle. As I got older, my fear didn't begin to fade away. It only grew worse and worse. It's common to an infant to cry and scream when they're left alone in the dark, but at 9-year-old, my parents tried their best to fix me. They tried coddling me, they tried tough love. Nothing worked. I would only scream louder because even more brilliant. I shout and kick and I shake, and eventually they couldn't take it anymore. By the time I was 11, I had 2 flashlights in my bed, a candle on my desk, and the 2 lamps hooked up to those clapping devices so I could light up the whole room without getting out of my bed. By the time I was 12, my parents realized the problem wasn't going away on its own. A therapy didn't help very much. I was introduced to a long line of psychologists and experts who ultimately couldn't help me. I was never given a different diagnosis, though the different therapists I saw suspected I suffered from any numbers of illnesses, ranging from schizophrenia to post-traumatic stress. The older I become, the more vivid and real my fear felt. As early as I was 5, my mind would play tricks on me in the dark. I would think I saw some strange pair of glowing red lights, almost like eyes, piercing through me, staring in no particular direction. They weren't wide and round, they were squinted and glaring. When I saw them, I would feel them on me. It was burning and painful sensation. I felt like I was hating myself. I would blink and they would fade away. Eventually, I began to imagine these eyes were a part of the figure. Some kind of shapeless, formless creature. One that did not dwell within the darkness, but living part of it. Like some kind of old growth, it fettered inside. Never breathing, never fading, but alive. Every creature and society had their own myths and legends, but nearly all of them had some form of boogeyman, some kind of horrible demonic monster that hides under beds and in closets and eats bad children who don't listen to their parents. In our neighborhood, we had something called the Shadow Man. Kids, teenagers, and even some adults would talk about him, spreading his legends. The story and description changed from person to person, but a few key elements always stayed the same. The Shadow Man was a tall figure with no distinctive features. The shape of his head and body made him seem like he was wearing a hat and a coat, similar to what a child's general idea of a stranger might be. In some versions of the story, he would have a tendril growing out of his back or tendrils growing out of his arm. Other versions would have a giant hand with a long, sharp, claw-like fingers. People said that they seen him before they go to sleep in their dreams, or even just walking around at night. He might be standing over them as they lay in bed, or walking around the hallway of their home and touching things. If you try too hard to focus on him, he disappears. But if you couldn't concentrate or stay awake long enough, he would become closer. Nobody said exactly what he does when he gets to you. Whenever I heard a new story about the Shadow Man, I would feel like I heard it before, even if I was brand new. It almost like a represent memory. It felt subconscious and surreal. Every new thing I learned, every new word I hear, it all felt like it was already part of me, because all of these stories, my supposed hallucinations became much more lucid and clear. I saw the red eyes on the one shapeless figure. He looked bigger than human, and it wasn't right. His figures were too long and already molded, too otherworldly. It wasn't natural. Even now, at the age of 29, my situation hasn't improved. Before, I could function normally during the day, but now the form of darkness, no matter how small, would fill me with anxiety whenever I looked at the shadow. I saw moments I see small fingers moving around and shaking. I saw pulsing shifts in shadow, and it themselves were alive, like the organs part of some greater sleeping creature. Although I had difficulty with my own reality, my dreams were far, far worse. I had always nightmares as a child, but as my mind grew and my imagination became more lucid and vivid, my nights were more graphic and terrible. My dreams were quite difficult to describe. The things not as events and situations, but abductions, images, and momentary information of an abnormal unclear. Like an independent art film, I was a part of a shapeless, infinite mass of total darkness. I was like the Shadow Man, totally featureless and fully black. The darkness surrounded felt like a living organism, like a light or shadow, but entirely muscular, pulsing inside, careless, and the greater being whose excitedly could nearly be explained nor understood. It made sense to me when I thought about it. Darkness is not a condition of lighting, it's a natural state of the universe. Light temporarily fades away, light bulbs burn out, fires fade, the sun sets, and eventually will fade away itself. But darkness is permanent. Darkness never fades, never runs away, and never burns. It's a cloak of the universe, it's our universe. I barely slept anymore. I would lie awake at night for hours on end. I've seen movements and shapes in the shadows. I had seen the red eyes glowing at me for a fraction of seconds before disappearing, and for a brief period, I believed I saw the Shadow Man himself walking around, slipping through cracks and seams of the walls before disappearing entirely. When I would sleep, I'd wake up after only 4 or 5 hours and felt terrible the rest of the day. I'd wake up feeling exhausted, disoriented, and stay that way for the rest of the night. My employer was sympathetic of my issues, but his patience was running out. If I couldn't do my job properly, he would have to fire me entirely. There was no question. My therapist recommended something called lucid dreaming to me. It was simple. By practicing a few different contemporary methods, I could eventually take control of my dreams and stop my night terrors completely. The idea of finally sleeping comfortably at night was too tempting, not necessary to resist. To begin lucid dreaming, you need to lie perfectly still for 40 minutes straight, allowing certain functions of your mind to shut down. The entire time your body sabotages you get random muscle spasms, you become uncomfortable, you're persistent, and you have to move around, you itch in a strange place. You have to ignore all of this, resist the temptations to move even a little bit, all the possibility chances of lucid dreaming. This, combined with my severe anxiety and panic attacks, not to mention constant hallucinations, was downright impossible to achieve. Nights were absolutely painful to get through on their own, and my new therapist had made them worse. Every time I lay down, my world becomes a battlefield. Finally, I decided that it couldn't start hallucinating on my own. I used a drug to do it. This was definitely and worst decision of my life. I had observed many difficult kinds of prescriptions of medication and narcotics. They had any strange consistent effects on me. Sometimes would make me pass out. Sometimes I would be too wired to stay still. Sometimes I would go into a psychotic rage and break things. All of this as my hallucinations became worse and worse by day. The moment I saw the darkness and had become to form shapes and beginnings, a rat-like creature and insects were really there. A claw of tender dancing around face and organ appearing in the wall. But the worst of it was the Shadow Man. I began to see him more and more, and my visions of him became bold and intractable. Although my appearance was humanoid, he clearly wasn't human. He was a monster, some kind of demon living in a silhouette. I had been things were getting better after I found the right combination of drugs. I wasn't angry, I wasn't wired, and I didn't pass out unconscious. I was so aware. The muscle spasms and random urges that had kept me awake was gone now. I could finally stay still, but now I couldn't move. It was something called sleep paralysis. It was something I once feared, but I spent more and more miserable days of sleepless state of consciousness. I forgot all about it until it happened to me. This function of my mind that allowed my muscles and limbs to move was deactivated now. My entire body was frozen. I always left the television on with the sound muted to the light on my room, but right at the worst moment my power went out. The room was shrouded in total blackness. The terrifying visions that had plagued me ever since childhood were now worse than ever. A horrible stillness in my worst fears. Everything around me was alive and moving. Horrible creatures that only resembled insects and crawl around. Pulsing organs and gooey butters pulsed around me. My nightmares, tendons, and limbs contracted to another, and the waves back and forth and vibrated senselessly. Large shapes formed all around the walls that appeared to be some kind of organism sprouting or growth spitting out. Living that was on a long, unlikable spider beetle, with my body that looked like a stitched together from a raw meat exoskeleton piece. The room itself lost its shape and senses of reason. It was almost a vortex spinning infinitely with no borders or barriers of kind. Strange spirals and resembled vortexes would appear briefly, spinning needlessly and warping and shifting everything that came near to them into eventually an unnatural, disgusting shape of form like nothing I had ever seen before. My surroundings appeared to be almost rotting and decayed, and I became more and more effortless and intricate. In the molten center of empty nothing, the interior were growing red eyes that had haunted me as long as I had existed. Slowly, the shape of the Shadow Man formed into a whopping humanoid figure that towered over me. My body shifted and motions into inhuman and unnatural way. He appeared to me as I knew him. Featureless man with a trench-coat hat. His hands were stretched out into a long pair of hideous claws, and now a figure that appeared almost like a twig or talon. 4 long, flowing tendons swung carelessly out of his back. He slowly began to approach me, although I was no longer sure if I even had secondary form anymore, or if I had become one of the surrounding greater masses of organs and pulsing gloom through the form that my world now. The Shadow Man knew what part of me had not yet been taken by an endless void of consuming me. I wanted to scream, I wanted to struggle, I wanted to jump up and run, but I couldn't move. There was nothing left of me now. The Shadow Man, piercing as long as tendons, into a seamlessly vacuum, but were once the limbs of a straightened form and abdomen still hung. He climbed upon my chest, his gilbert screams eyes burned into my endeavorly shell, and he curled his disgusting long fingers around what could only be my neck and had become the wrap around me, not like hands, but more like twins of ribbons. As if a syringe was being placed into my veins, I felt being drained from my broken and deformed blood. I had become a literal physically parted remains of my body, being severed and dissolved. It felt my very existence was slowly being enrolled. I felt as I was becoming part of the darkness itself. Right at the moment the door of my apartment swung open, the power had returned to my building, and the lights in the hallway filled the room. Everything had vanished in a blink of an eye. The shapeless mass, hideous creature, and terrible figure that I was sure had become my entire universe had vanished completely. My apartment was now eliminated, returns its original state of existence. My body has returned to its normal form, and my limbs exactly as if nothing had happened. My landlord stood in the doorway calling my name. When he saw me, he had quite a shock. My skin was pale and white, my eyes were bloodshot and wide open. Sweat was pouring down my face. I looked like a zombie or a drug addict. He shook me. He asked me if I was all right. I could barely move, but I could speak. I made only one plea to him. Don't let the lights go out. If you like that story as much as I did, please subscribe to my channel and turn on post notifications so you'll know when my next video comes out. And I'll see you guys in my next video.